My play of the day from round 2 of the Wijk aan Zee tournament is the game between Anish Giri against Arkadij Naiditsch. Let's get straight on with the game. Giri with the white pieces, and it's a Bogo Indian. Here we are, the check. And now white has various ways of meeting the check. You can put your knight on c3 and that will transpose to a Nimzo Indian, or you can play bishop d2. Very solid, or you can play, I think the most principled move, knight d2, and try to grab the two bishops. And now, well, black can respond in various ways. For example, b6 is one of the main lines, and then white will get the two bishops. You can recapture with queen or bishop in this case. But Naiditsch plays in the sharpest way. He just castles here. And after a3, instead of taking on d2, it's a little bit late now, goes back to e7 with the bishop. Now, it looks rather passive, but if white plays something like e3, then d5, and you'll see this knight isn't best placed on d2, it really should be on c3. Black doesn't have any great difficulties there. You can see also the bishop on c1 is blocked in. So really, if white wants to get anything from this position, he has to advance in the centre with e4. Now, this has all been seen before. It's a theoretical line. It's very sharp indeed. Of course, black has to strike out straight away, otherwise he'll get rolled off the board. So d5 is a forced move. And this is obviously a very sharp line indeed. White pushes on, and the knight drops back to d7. Now, black can sort of get away with this because this knight is on seemingly a poor square on d2, because that knight, you can see, can't go anywhere at the moment because of that pawn on d5. Nevertheless, with the pawn on e5, this gives white some attacking chances, so bishop d3 is the obvious move. Now, if black doesn't strike out, then of course white will be left with this wonderful space advantage, so black has to attack the centre. And you can see now that the pawn is on c4, well, white would like to nudge the pawn one square back to cover the pawn on d4, and it would be just like a French defence, but you can see that in this case with the pawn on c4, white's centre is actually a little bit vulnerable, so black is undermining this pawn on e5. So it's a very tense situation indeed. Now, the old way of playing this for white, this line was popular in the late 80s, was simply to take on d5 and castle and support the pawn on e5 in this way. This is quite playable, but in the last 10 years or so, this very direct move, h4, has become very popular. The idea is extremely crude. If black now takes on d4, then we have this classic bishop sacrifice. In England we call this the Greek gift sacrifice. And if this is taken, then white checkmates rapidly, for example with queen h5. And this has all been seen before. Or if king g6, well, there's usually some way to get at the king when it comes to g6, either with queen g4, queen c2, or in this case, the best move is actually to play h5 check and tempt the king forward. And if king here, then knight here, and there's going to be a deadly discovered check. Or queen d3 is very nasty indeed, threatening a mate. Very typical ideas. So black has to react. This is a clear threat in this position. h6 is possible here. Naiditsch played g6. This has also been seen before. The problem is if you play h6, then it rather weakens this diagonal. The diagonal is still open, so white can drop back and try to attack very quickly along the diagonal. So g6 allows white to open up the h-file, but it well, I mean, there are pros and cons to both moves, both ways of defending against the sacrifice. So, black has time just for a moment to try and break down white's centre. And now queen c2, and white is threatening something very obvious here, a sacrifice here on g6. So black gets in there quickly. Of course, if pawn takes here now, black has knight takes bishop check, rather important, and only then recaptures on g6. This has all been seen before, apparently. Pawn takes has previously been seen, and then knight takes, and the game goes on. Naiditsch took on d3, and then took on d5 with the queen, so this takes the game in very different lines. Now, the problem with taking, well, there are pros and cons obviously to taking with the queen. You activate the queen and start trying to get some counterplay maybe against this pawn, but the disadvantage is that now that the pawn has disappeared from d5, then the knight can come to this ideal square on e4 looking at f6, and you can see now the great advantage of having the pawn on e5. It marks out territory on the king side. Knight c6 played, and bishop h6, so although white is a pawn down, has a fantastic initiative. And here, for example, if black were to take on e5, then that's a nice move. First, let's get the pin out, get the queen away from pinning the knight. And for example, if queen here, we can take and take here, and white has a raging attack. I mean, it's a dynamic material balance, bishop and two pawns against a rook, which normally, well, is often okay for the bishop and two pawns, but here, when black is really underdeveloped, then it looks very good for white. So this is black's basic problem in the position, that he's yet to develop his queen side, while white is developing his attack very, very quickly. For example, if rook e8, if the rook just moves, then, for example, the bishop comes back and suddenly white is going to get in on f6. So, Naiditsch checked on a5. Well, obviously white doesn't really want to block on this square with a minor piece. That would slow things down, and don't forget it might still be possible to take on e5. King f1 is a tempting move actually, and then just to continue with the attack, but b6 is rather irritating, threatening bishop here, and once that bishop comes in the game, then black has better chances to defend. So Giri played queen d2 and went into an endgame, but although the queens were off the board, actually his initiative continued. It's very interesting indeed. He's still a pawn down, but he has tremendous play on the king side and on these weakened dart squares. Black would like to keep his pawn structure intact like this, but he gets checkmated straight away. And now a very crude but effective plan of bishop g7 and rook h8 isn't really parryable in this position. So black recaptured with the f pawn. Not a beautiful move, really damages black's pawn structure, but absolutely forced. And then bishop g5. So white's still trying to get in on f6, and strategically looks like a very good idea to swap these bishops, because it weakens all these dart squares. So h5 was played. I think it had to be played actually, otherwise knight f6 would come and then white breaks through on h7. And now perhaps the best idea for white here is to take on e7 and then just play g4 and crack open the king side, and this looks incredibly dangerous. Look, black still isn't developed, and white has a safe king, fantastic coordination and active knights. I think it would be very difficult to defend that position. Instead, Giri went for it straight away with g4. I mean, I don't know exactly what he overlooked, but after this, black was able to take on e5, and I mean, white still has a fantastic initiative here. But of course it's not so simple. I mean, compare those last two positions with the knight on e7 and white still having the pawn on e5. That was very clear. This one is still tricky, but still very, very difficult for black to defend. Now maybe the best idea is just to bring the bishop out here and try to defend this position. It's not easy. I mean, it's one of these situations where it's very hard to judge whether to give back material or cling on to material, or, you know, defense is always much more difficult than attack. And I think we're seeing that in this game. I mean, this looks like a tempting move because suddenly white's coordination is not so good here. But, well, you know, maybe this knight goes to a5 here. I think it should have gone to e5, and I think that might be the best chance to defend. But very, very difficult to understand this position. I mean, this is, for example, this is so sharp, and suddenly, you know, there are mate threats. I mean, I think it seems as though black can probably just about defend here, but really not easy. So the knight went to a5, and I think, Naiditsch overlooked something here. I mean, in principle, it looks like a very odd square indeed for the knight, but I think he underestimated white's attacking chances. Perhaps he's only seen this, and it seems as though black can defend, and that's the obvious way. But Giri played a really, really good move here, rook c1. And I can see how it would be very easy to underestimate this move. Basically, white is just bringing the rook into play, and however black tries to defend against this, something cracks. For example, if the rook blocks, then we take and play rook here, just defending that pawn, and suddenly there's a threat of this, and pawn takes, and the threats are too much. For example, if bishop c6, then we play here, and suddenly that knight is trapped. I mean, there are all kinds of weird tactics here. Or if the bishop comes to e8, we play h6, and suddenly there's a threat to advance this pawn further, and, you know, maybe get in on f7 or maybe knight f6. I mean, this is so dangerous. Going back here, if knight takes pawn, we take. I mean, threats, very nasty threats indeed here, of playing the rook down and coming in here. So king g7, and then just rook here, and rook h7, and white's initiative is just absolutely deadly. What else? If knight c6, I mean, this looks sensible to try and block out the rook. Then we just take here and bring the knight in. And if, say, rook g8, then king comes across and the rook is going to come across, and this is extremely nasty. So Naiditsch tried to block the rook out with bishop c6, but this was also very difficult indeed, and probably by this stage black is close to being lost, and now it turned into a king hunt. If rook c8, well, we'll take, and white's initiative continues. Obviously knight f6 check is a threat here, so the rook comes across, and now white just grabs pawns, and when the rook controls the 7th rank like this, then you can see that black's king is always going to be in trouble. Good winning chances for white there. The king came up, but this really is the end now, because the king just gets caught in a mating net. And now a very cool move, f3, and if black tries to defend like this, then the hapless knight at the side of the board actually gets caught like this, and white should be winning. So e5 was played, but now this is the end. Threatening rook f7. And after this, there was no sensible defence to... Well, there's absolutely no defence to rook h4, actually. I think once again we see a really good illustration of the power of the initiative. It's far easier to attack than it is to defend, but a very convincing victory by Anish Giri. And he now has 1.5 out of 2. And also on 1.5, Levon Aronian, who won a beautiful technical game against Caruana, Sergei Karyakin, Hikaru Nakamura, and yeah, the 5 of them all lead with 1.5 out of 2. Thanks very much for watching.